Hello everyone, and welcome to LEGO Star Wars Hot Takes, episode 42. As always, if you have any hot takes or controversial opinions about LEGO Star Wars that you want me to discuss next week, make sure to go ahead and drop them down in the comments below. But jumping right into it, this first one comes from Kanban. He says, hot take, the mini-scale AT-AT should never have been made. The line is called Starship Collection for a reason. It's like the Dark Trooper helmet with the helmet series. It's not a helmet, and the AT-AT is not a starship. And I disagree with this quite a bit, actually. But first off, I have to say, I'm not really trying to defend the mini-scale AT-AT. I think the set on paper was a good idea, which I'll get more into here in a second, but the actual execution of it was not the greatest. There are some things about it that I really like, but there's also some stuff about it that I don't like, especially the price. It's very expensive, and there's also a few issues with the shaping of the model here and there. So again, I'm not necessarily going to defend this set. However, I disagree with your comment because I do want LEGO to experiment with more ground vehicles as mini-scale sets in the future. You mentioned the sub-theme being called the Starship Collection, and originally back in 2009 and 2010 when they first made these sets, it wasn't called that. It was just called mini-scale, and then as we know, it got canceled for over 10 years, and then in 2023 they brought it back with the mini-scale Executor, and that's when they rebranded it to the Starship Collection, which is what you're talking about. And I personally always thought that rebranding in 2023 was unnecessary because it restricted them to just making starships, and then with this AT-AT they kind of had to make a big deal about breaking out of the restriction when it should have just stayed mini-scale in the first place, so they wouldn't have restricted themselves and could have made ground vehicles to begin with when they brought it back. So that's why I disagree with your comment. I think the Starship Collection was a restriction they put on themselves, and it seems like with this AT-AT they kind of broke out of it, which I'm happy about. And I would love to see like a mini-scale turbo tank and maybe like a mini-scale ATTE in the future. Darnley_10 says, hot take, the 2000 P2 clones had the same issue as the modern stormtroopers. Both helmets are oversized and ugly looking, yet only one gets hate. The nostalgia bias is real and people need to be more consistent in their arguments. And well, first of all, yes, I do agree the 2005 Phase 2 clone troopers do have a lot of nostalgia bias from the community. However, when comparing them to the modern stormtroopers, that's a bit of a different story. First of all, these original Phase 2 clone troopers came out when LEGO Star Wars was still relatively new, so they were always trying new things, and they definitely weren't getting things perfect, and they weren't as high quality as they are now. So that actually gives them kind of an excuse, because it's like, hey, it was 2005, they're obviously not going to be 100% perfect, and they're obviously not going to be 100% modern, and like every other minifigure when they were first made, they weren't the greatest, and then LEGO improved on them over time. So that right there obviously gives them a bit of an excuse to have oversized helmets. And then on top of that, not to mention those original Phase 2 Clone Trooper helmets were modeled after the Phase 2 Clone Trooper helmets in the 2003 Clone Wars, and in that show, they are a bit oversized. So yeah, these original Phase 2 Clone Troopers have a lot of excuses and valid reasons as to why they look the way they do. But the modern Stormtroopers, on the other hand, are not the same. The reason people don't like these is because LEGO went backwards. In 2015 or 2016, around that time with the Rogue One Stormtrooper helmets, they got it perfect. They weren't oversized, the shaping looked good, and they could actually turn their heads. But then they kind of backtracked and made these new oversized helmets that just look sloppy, they can't turn their heads, and they're disproportionate, which is the reason they get hate, and the 2005 oversized Phase 2 Clone Trooper helmets don't get hate, because you're comparing the first iteration of a figure 20 years ago when LEGO Star Wars was still relatively new to the latest iteration of a modern figure that is not the best one they've made. So obviously that's why the Stormtrooper is getting more hate. Captain Gregor of the Foxtrot, what a name, he says, hot take, the Clone Wars minifigure faces are not that bad. They're unique and resemble their on-screen animated counterparts very well. And well, you're right about that last part, they do resemble the on-screen source material. However, the reason people hate on them or make fun of them or make memes about them or whatever you want to say is because they just look super goofy. And the reason is because, well, the Clone Wars characters in general look pretty goofy, but they all had different head shapes that kind of complemented their face designs, and LEGO tried to take those face designs and then cram them onto a minifigure head that wasn't supposed to complement their face design, if that makes sense. So like you have Count Dooku with this crazy looking head, and then LEGO tries to take that face design and put it on a head that's a completely different shape, and that's just why they look goofy and kind of uncanny. That's why Padme looks goofy, that's why Mace Windu looks goofy, that's why Palpatine looks super cursed, is because again, LEGO tried to take these face designs that were on a specific head shape and then force them onto a LEGO head shape. And I mean, in theory, that's fine because it did make them, for the most part, resemble what's on screen. However, they just look really cursed, and that's why they've become kind of infamous. Breadbox says, hot take, the UCS Imperial Shuttle does not hold up, especially in the cockpit, and the minifigures are boring. And well, you're right about the minifigures, they are pretty boring because they came out in 2010 when LEGO Star Wars minifigures were, well, pretty boring because they just had very minimal printing, pretty much just flesh tones with no leg printing. That's literally how they all looked in that era. So yeah, the minifigures in this set are pretty bland. However, the build itself, I would not say the build is overrated. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think this could be re-released today in 2026, but I do think that for 2010, it was pretty far ahead of its time, and it's a very beautiful looking model on the outside. Now, you mentioned the cockpit, and if you're talking about the interior, that is something I will agree on. The interior of the cockpit in this set is very bland, and even for 2010, I think they could have done a little bit more. But aside from the interior of the cockpit, I think the build as a whole is amazing on the outside. And again, don't get me wrong, I don't think it holds up in 2026 when LEGO remakes this set, whenever that will be. I do think it will be a lot better than this one. However, for the time being, considering this is the only UCS Imperial Shuttle we have, it's pretty good. Building Lego says, hot take, the OG Jango Fett Slave 1 is one of the best sets of all time. And as much as I love that set and appreciate how iconic it is, I can't help but disagree with you here. As good as that set is, I think considering it one of the best ever made is just nostalgia bias, because if you look at it, it's clearly outdated. The only reason people like it so much is because for the longest time it was the only Jango Fett Slave 1 we had, but when you compare it to all of the Slave 1s LEGO has ever made, including Jango Fett's and Boba Fett's, it's definitely one of the weaker ones. And as much as I love this set, I'm just not gonna sit here and act like it's one of the best sets ever made, because it's not. I mean, it's outdated. It's over 20 years old. I guess I could give it like top 50 maybe of all time. Zoidal says, hot take, the Rebels Ahsoka is way overrated. Value is the only cool thing about the fig. And I can see why you're saying this. I mean, people usually say this about valuable figs, and most of the time it is true. A lot of valuable figs aren't overrated just because they're rare. However, in this case, with this Rebels Ahsoka, I actually have to disagree, because I think the fig looks really, really good. The headpiece mold is absolutely incredible, and then on top of that, there's no issues with the printing anywhere. It has nice continuous printing from the torso to the legs, and there's no miscoloration or anything like that. I mean, the figure just simply looks good. And on top of that, the reason people like it so much is because at the time, it was the first sort of older version of Ahsoka that LEGO had made to include the longer Targruta tentacles, or whatever they're called. So yeah, I can see why you're saying this, because it is a rare figure. However, I have to disagree. The figure looks really good, in my opinion. Way Comment says, hot take, we need an updated General Grievous minifigure. The current design leaves a lot to be desired. He's inspired by the outdated 2008 Clone Wars style. He's too short, has a force hunchback, and he can't rotate his wrist to spin his lightsabers. And until I read this comment, I honestly had never really thought about this that much, but what you're saying actually is really valid. I think we could use a new General Grievous minifigure. The current one they're using, well, I say current, just the most recent one, they've had for over a decade. They introduced it in 2010 and then released it again in 2014 and then in 2020, which is quite a long time for a Star Wars figure to stay relatively the same. And an updated one, like you mentioned, having rotating wrists so you can spin the lightsabers, and then also being a bit taller, would be really nice. And honestly, since LEGO hasn't made Grievous in so long, the last time being in 2020, that does make me wonder if they are currently in the process of designing a new one. Anyways though guys, that's gonna do it for this week's episode. As always, if you have any hot takes, make sure to go ahead and drop them down in the comments below. If you're new, please consider subscribing, and if you want to check out more of my videos, you can see them on the screen right now.